Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, Senator Edward M. Kennedy and the bridge at Chappaquiddick. Now let's continue with our story about Senator Edward M. Kennedy and the bridge at Chappaquiddick. When Gargan exploded with expletives and incredulity, Senator Kennedy calmly reiterated what occurred after he left the two at the ferry slip and dove into the water. He entered the Shiretown Inn unobserved, changed his clothes, and then went to the front desk, speaking with the night manager briefly and asking about the time, which was 2:25 a.m. He then went to bed and got up at 7 a.m. and interacted again with both hotel employees and guests. Clearly, he was setting the stage for an alibi that would fit with Mary Jo actually having driven the car off of the bridge and he, the senator, having nothing to do with it. His failure not to report the accident was deliberate in the hopes that Gargan would eventually change his mind and in true jovial fix-it fashion clean up the mess by going to the police and dishing up the Mary Jo story, leaving Kennedy essentially out of it. Gargan was now more appalled than angry, realizing that Kennedy had deliberately left them on the island so that he could get back to Edgartown and construct an alibi. He made it clear that the more time that passed without reporting the incident, the worse it would look both personally and legally. Ted Kennedy then said before he did anything, he needed to make a phone call. Gargan knew from experience that on regatta weekend, there was a line waiting for every payphone on the Edgartown side. He suggested that all three of them head over to the payphone near the Chappaquiddick ferry slip. Within minutes, Ted Kennedy was on the phone, calling who specifically Gargan did not know. While both he and Markham milled around the payphone area, they saw the tow truck getting off of the ferry, most likely heading to the accident site. One of the ferry deckhands also came over, obviously thinking that Kennedy knew nothing of the accident, and called out to the senator that his car had been found in the water near Dyke Bridge. Markham ran interference and told the young man that yes, they knew about it. It was now clear that any more delay was out of the question. Gargan suggested that Markham take Kennedy back to the police station, and he, Gargan, would go back to the cottage and try to keep that situation as calm as possible. But Gargan also wanted no part with being involved with filing a false police report if Kennedy still stuck to the Mary Jo was driving scenario. Gargan got into the Valiant that was parked near the ferry slip, and on the way back to the cottage ran into 5 partygoers walking towards the ferry. Esther Newberg, the Lyons sisters, La Rosa, and Crimmins. He told them to get in the car, that there had been an accident. He wouldn't say anything else until he got the whole group together at the cottage. There he merely said, "The senator has been in an accident, and we can't find Mary Jo." He told the 2 men to completely clean up the house and remove evidence of a party, even to the last pretzel. He would come back for them after he drove the women back to the ferry. Some of the women already seemed to grasp the politically explosive ramifications of what was unfolding. Gargan getting into a lengthy exchange with Nancy Lyons, who kept insisting that somebody else should claim that they were driving the car. Gargan was just as adamant that this was not possible and the senator was driving. When he got the remaining girls to the Edgartown side, he had Charlie Tretter drive them back to the motel. He told him that he would come over to the hotel personally in a few hours with more information. Once all of the women were all off of his hands, Gargan quickly walked by the police station, which already had an unusual crowd in front, indicative of Senator Kennedy inside. Again, not wanting to get involved with that process, Gargan did eventually make his way to the Katama Shores Motel with Charlie Tretter. He He finally made it clear to the remaining 5 women that there was a terrible accident with Senator Kennedy driving off of the bridge, and most likely Mary Jo was dead. Their reaction was initially one of anguish and crying, and then ultimately anger over not being told what had happened in the early morning hours. They also began to ask specific questions that Gargan, not knowing what Senator Kennedy would say to police and not wanting to give out contradictory information, evaded. He then strongly advised them to clear out of the motel and let Charlie Treader get them to the ferry as quickly as possible. Get home and don't talk to anyone. With that, he headed back to the police station, now intent on exactly what the senator had told the police. With many loose ends still to sort out, Gargan got a hold of Markham at the station and took a quick look at the statement that Ted Kennedy and Markham put together at Chief Arena's request. All he really cared about was whether or not the senator admitted to being at the wheel, which he did. Gargan then quickly left, checked out of the Shiretown Inn, paid the charter boat captain that would have taken the boiler room girls out again to watch that day's regatta, also telling the captain that he could keep the money, but plans had changed, and then Gargan headed back to the cottage to pick up La Rosa and Crimmins. Several individuals, including the owner, Sidney Lawrence, who quickly came to inspect his property upon hearing of the accident, later stated that the only refuse left were 8 empty Coca-Cola bottles. Not a single liquor bottle or anything associated with alcohol was present, although it was rumored that a large number of liquor bottles were found at the town dump. Unusually, some of them were thrown away unopened. By mid-afternoon, Gargan, Crimmins, and La Rosa had also gotten a ferry at Vineyard Haven and gotten off of the island. Ted Kennedy's exodus from his sailing weekend-turned-nightmare was even more abrupt. Chief Arena had given the senator and Markham the courtesy of a private office in the police station where they could compose a statement about the incident. Arena then returned to the Dyke Bridge area to ensure that the appropriate medical examiner was involved, and the scene was reasonably under control. But he did not remain long, not wanting to keep the senator waiting. Predictably, the chief medical examiner was off on Saturdays. His stand-in was Dr. Donald Mills, the associate medical examiner of Dukes County, who was actually more concerned with a woman he had left in labor in a Vineyard hospital. After a cursory physical examination, which notably revealed that Ms. Chappaquiddick was not wearing underwear, he quickly ruled the decedent as a victim of drowning and ordered her removed to a funeral home, and Mary Jo's body was conveyed from the area by the funeral home's director, Eugene Free, who was also already present with his hearse. Mills, who knew Free well, hitched a ride in the vehicle, telling the director along the way to hold off on embalming, as the DA's office might ask for an autopsy, although he, Mills, did not feel this was necessary. With Mary Jo no longer in the back of the patrol car, Arena and Bob Brugiere headed back to the ferry and Edgartown. Within a few minutes, the chief was back in the station typing up the statement Ted Kennedy had dictated to Paul Markham. There was a blank when it came to the name of the passenger, when neither Kennedy or Markham could remember the correct spelling of Mary Jo Chappaquiddick's last name. Having finished his statement and making it clear to both Arena and Walter Steele, the part-time Dukes County special prosecutor and full-time Boston assistant DA, that he would not answer any further questions, Kennedy began leaning on Arena to figure out a way to get him out of the police station and even off of the island with little fanfare. Steele was basically hired on in the summertime to handle an increased caseload of petty crimes associated with the tourist high season, and had routinely come down to the police station to see if anything major occurred overnight when he stumbled on the ever-increasing commotion at the station. Arena had already heard from the only Democratic official in the entire region, Selectman Robert Carroll, also a prominent businessman and owner of a small Piper Comanche prop plane. Carroll had heard rumors about the accident, and Arena tersely confirmed them by phone. Carroll concluded the conversation by offering to help in any way that he could. Minutes later, Arena called back and asked if Carroll could fly the Kennedy entourage to Hyannisport. Carroll agreed to meet the group at the Martha's Vineyard Airport, Arena also arranging for a Massachusetts Motor Vehicle Department official to chauffeur Kennedy in what turned out to be only Paul Markham to the airstrip. Markham and the senator were able to slip out of the back door of the police station without the crowd in front realizing it. The plane ride to Hyannisport was brief and virtually silent, Carroll realizing that neither man was interested in small talk. When the plane landed, Kennedy thanked Bob Carroll, and he and Markham got into a waiting car that took them to the Kennedy compound. Carroll made the trip back to the vineyard in a matter of minutes, the flight so brief that Ted Kennedy was back in Hyannisport by the middle of Saturday afternoon. As the afternoon wore on and news of the accident began to percolate, confusion on the part of the local legal apparatus in Dukes County only intensified. Asked several times, medical examiner Mills maintained that an autopsy was not necessary. Steele wasn't so sure, and he also felt that the county district attorney's office and chief investigator needed to be notified. Initially, Edmund Denise, the typically ambitious and boisterous DA, loudly pronounced that he was taking over the case immediately, which was his right as the chief county prosecutor. But minutes later, George Killen, the county's chief investigator, called back and said, "No, actually, Jim, since no alcohol was involved, this was strictly an automobile accident, and it was up to you to charge as you would any other vehicular incident." Most likely, Killen raised some of the realities with his boss as far as taking on the Kennedy machine with a possibly serious criminal charge, the initial publicity and prominence not worth the wrath of the most powerful political network in the state. The power of that network would become evident in a short period of time. Jim Arena had bent over backwards to accommodate the senator in how gently he was treated in the initial stages of the investigation, especially when Ted Kennedy was asked to produce his driver's license. Kennedy responded by saying that he had two automobiles, and one was in D.C., and he thought he might have left his license there. This assertion and Kennedy's rapid exit from Edgartown prompted an astonishing series of events. Although Arena and Steele knew that Ted Kennedy could possibly be charged with a much more serious offense under Massachusetts law, they eventually settled on the violation of leaving the scene of an accident. To prove manslaughter, they would have to prove that Kennedy was driving recklessly and with no witnesses and information as to what led up to the accident. That would be difficult to demonstrate. However, Kennedy leaving the scene and passing numerous homes where he could have immediately summoned help was also potentially manslaughter by the senator's failure to act. But neither Steele or Arena were ready to produce such a charge, understanding the reality of such a course of action in Massachusetts. However, to assemble a formal charge of leaving the scene of an accident, Arena would need Ted Kennedy's driver's license information. Late on Saturday, no longer with any physical access to Kennedy, Arena called the local vineyard outpost of the Department of Motor Vehicles and requested the appropriate information. An inspector named George Kennedy, no relation, told him that he would need to get back to him. Kennedy was being disingenuous. Having already been contacted by Ted Kennedy's assistant in Washington, David Burke, and told he could not find the senator's license, Kennedy contacted the state's central office in Boston and received word that the license of one Edward M. Kennedy, date of birth 2/22/32, had expired. The individual who pulled that information did not even make the connection to the senator at the time, but George Kennedy did, and was streetwise enough to call the regional head of the Massachusetts Department of Motor Vehicles, a man named Joe Grealish, who reported directly to the motor vehicles registrar who ran the entire department, Richard McLaughlin. When McLaughlin got word of the situation, he ordered Grealish to tell Kennedy and anybody else that no information about the expired license was to be released to Arena or anyone. He also told Grealish to have all of Ted Kennedy's license information pulled and placed on his Boston desk. Although he later denied any such thing, McLaughlin was rumored to have been observed in his Boston office on Saturday evening, and it would have been simple for such a high-ranking official to surreptitiously renew an expired license. Subsequent events proved that strings were pulled to address Ted Kennedy's license expiration issue. Although Paul Markham had requested that Jim Arena not release the senator's statement until he got clearance from the Kennedy camp, by mid-afternoon, having not heard back from anyone, Arena was starting to feel intimidated by the persistent shouting of journalists milling about the corridors of the police station. One of these individuals was summertime resident James Scotty Reston, a high-ranking executive at the New York Times, but also owner of the local Vineyard Gazette. Reston was becoming irate at Arena, refusing to even confirm fundamental facts about the incident. Finally, against the advice of Walter Steele, Arena felt he had no choice but to release Kennedy's statement. Before doing so, he was able to get Rosemary Keogh on the phone to confirm the spelling of Mary Jo Kopechne's name. The statement read, "On July 18, 1969, at approximately 11:15 p.m., in Chappaquiddick, Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts, I was driving my car on Main Street on my way to get to the ferry back to Edgartown. I was unfamiliar with the road and turned right onto Dyke Road instead of bearing hard left on Main Street. After proceeding for approximately 1/2 mile on Dyke Road, I descended a hill and came upon a narrow bridge. The car went off the side of the bridge. There was one passenger with me, one Miss Mary Jo Kopechne, a former secretary of my brother, Senator Robert Kennedy. The car turned over and sank into the water and landed with the roof resting on the bottom. I attempted to open the door and the window of the car, but have no recollection of how I got out of the car. I came to the surface and then repeatedly dove down to the car in an attempt to see if the passenger was still in the car. I was unsuccessful in the attempt. I was exhausted and in a state of shock. I recall walking back to where my friends were eating. There was a car parked in front of the cottage, and I climbed into the back seat. I then asked for someone to bring me back to Edgartown. I remember walking around for a period and then going back to my hotel room. When I fully realized what had happened this morning, I immediately contacted the police. There was no mention of the party, no mention of Gargan and Markham's attempt to rescue Mary Jo, a deliberate omission based on subsequent events. Arena only took a few additional shouted questions and, on the advice of Steele, retreated back into his office. He would not again interact with reporters and left the police station later that evening, having drawn up a citation without Senator Kennedy's license information that he presumed would be forthcoming. While Arena attempted to wind down his day with as little fanfare as possible, at Hyannisport, a hastily assembled brain trust of at least a dozen former Kennedy campaign and even government advisors were burning the midnight oil. After Kennedy aide Dunn Gifford ascertained that all of the partygoers had left the island by Saturday afternoon, he then followed up with a Vineyard Funeral Home to attempt to expedite the transportation of Mary Jo's body to her family in Pennsylvania. He also wanted to ensure that no autopsy took place. If such a procedure determined that Mary Jo's death was not by drowning but possibly asphyxiation, it would complicate things for Kennedy, who would look even worse after not immediately getting help from nearby homes and even waiting for 10 hours to report the accident. Mary Jo possibly still alive for some indeterminate length of time. Something became evident immediately, and that was that despite the story eventually blowing up nationally, there was no further statement or even public appearance of Senator Kennedy in the days immediately following the accident. He would not be seen publicly until the Tuesday after the incident, when he and a fairly sizable entourage, including his wife Joan, his sister-in-law Ethel Kennedy, and Joe Gargan flew in a private plane from Cape Cod to Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, en route to Plymouth, Pennsylvania, where the funeral would be held, Plymouth close to where Mary Jo was born. The Kennedy group met privately with the Kopechnes at the church rectory. No press allowed access. Both Joan and Ted Kennedy were both clearly distraught, Joan pregnant, having to face the reality of her husband having been at the wheel of a car containing a single woman, Ted looking downcast, wearing a back brace, possibly emphasizing that he was in physical pain after the accident, one of the excuses given for his lack of any additional public comment on the situation. Mary Jo's mother, Gwen, was especially overcome during the proceedings, frequently sobbing and having to be comforted by her husband, Joseph. At the funeral mass's conclusion, it took a phalanx of men, including Joe Gargan, to push through the crowd gathered in front of the church. Kennedy and his group then proceeded to the burial And after again briefly interacting with the Chappaquiddick, they were back on their plane, which landed at Cape Cod in the early afternoon. A press gaggle peppered the senator with questions. Practically gritting his teeth, he responded by saying he would speak at an appropriate time, but this was not the appropriate time. He lost his temper with Liz Trotta of NBC, who was especially confrontational about the incident and his political future. Stopping in his tracks, he said directly to her, "I have just come from the funeral of a very lovely girl, and this is not the appropriate time." Predictably, this only prompted more speculation and public attention. Kennedy then had to deal with the citation for leaving the scene of an accident, formally filed by Jim Arena on Monday. Arena was presented with Ted Kennedy's license details, information provided personally to him on Sunday by Joe Grealish and George Kennedy. A driver's license allegedly renewed on February 6, 1969. Unfortunately, the senator's own public records indicated that he was in Fall River, Massachusetts on this particular day and days before and after, involved in various political events and appearances. Nevertheless, Arena accepted the information. This mysterious license valid through February 22, 1971. He would never find out about the expired license during the legal proceeding surrounding the case. Had the chief, or anyone else for that matter, known about this expiration, it would have served as the basis to allow a manslaughter indictment, driving without a license, de facto negligence involving a fatality. Ted Kennedy retained a legal expert on Massachusetts vehicular accident law, Robert Clark, a former district court judge. The Kennedy camp was anxious to put the matter behind the senator, at least any formal legal proceedings. Clark cut a deal with Steele and Arena to plead the senator guilty to leaving the scene of an accident and arranged for a rapid court proceeding on the morning of July 25th. Steele indicated he would accept such a plea and agree to a suspended sentence. The Mass DMV already had suspended Kennedy's license, a formality until a hearing occurred in a case in which a fatality occurred. The only wild card was District Court Judge James Boyle, who did not have to accept the sentence and could impose both more time and incarceration. However, after only a 7-minute proceeding, Boyle sentenced Senator Kennedy to the minimum of 2 months, suspended the sentence, and stated that based on the individual's youth and clean driving record as stated by the probation officer in his court, he felt this was appropriate. He also stated that the defendant would already suffer more than any sentence he could impose. Kennedy quickly exited with his wife, escorted by 2 state troopers out of the front of the building. His only response to reporters' shouted questions, a statement that he would speak to the people of Massachusetts that evening. Escorted by motorcycle police, his entourage was then driven back to the Kennedy family yacht, which conveyed the senator back to Hyannisport. Only that morning, the Associated Press had published a story detailing the senator's Virginia driving record. But as this was not in the state motor vehicle records, officially these transgressions didn't exist. Arena and Steele were left to deal with the press fallout. Only a brief recitation in court by Arena of the evidence was the only information provided about the incident, and this left more questions and confusion about the senator's action. By the evening of the 25th, all 3 networks planned to broadcast the speech nationwide. However, no reporters or press other than technicians from local Boston station WHDH were to be allowed into the senator's Hyannisport home or the Kennedy compound, and there would be no questions following the speech. At 7:30, the speech began, Kennedy reading from a manuscript written mostly by Ted Sorensen, a longtime Kennedy advisor, and a speechwriter especially for Senator Robert Kennedy. Beginning the previous weekend, a myriad of former Kennedy administration officials and advisors had conferred with Ted Kennedy over how he should handle the incident and what should be discussed in his speech. These included Stephen Smith, Kennedy's brother-in-law and family investment manager, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, RFK advisor Richard Goodwin, administrative assistant David Burke, and Congressman and close friend John Culver. Kennedy began by explaining that to speak publicly about the accident before his legal proceeding occurred would be improper, thereby justifying his silence. He described the reason for the get-together, emphasized that this was an effort to cheer up former members of the RFK campaign who were still grieving over the senator's assassination. Kennedy specifically denied any relationship with Mary Jo Chappaquiddick and also denied driving under the influence of liquor. Kennedy then discussed the accident itself, specifically stating that he left at 11:15 p.m., his sensation of almost drowning, his confusion and claimed concussion that he said influenced some of his subsequent decisions, including walking all of the way back to the cottage instead of immediately summoning help, an action he now described as indefensible. He brought up the efforts of Markham and Gargan and again described failure to promptly report the accident as the result of confusion and shock, and also described the impulsive action of swimming to Edgartown after the ferry closed for the evening, also explaining that he instructed Gargan and Markham not to alarm Mary Jo's friends that night. Kennedy concluded this portion of the speech by explaining that he pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. He then looked directly into the camera, and while reading from cue cards held by Joe Gargan, Kennedy began to speculate as to whether the people of Massachusetts still had faith in him as a senator, and he asked his constituents to contact him to express their opinion on the matter. He concluded by saying that based on these opinions, he would reflect on whether he could continue to serve. Some crucial responses to Kennedy's speech were forthcoming from Chief Arena, who called it a moving and eloquent speech. The senator bared his soul to the country, and you have to admire a man for that. Gwen Chappaquiddick, within hours, stated, "I am satisfied with the senator's statement, and I do hope he decides to stay in the Senate." But her husband's response would be echoed by many media figures when he seemed almost baffled by Kennedy's account. And there was skepticism from locals like ferryboat employee Richard Hewitt, who called Kennedy's account of swimming the channel a lot of baloney. Only days after the incident, scuba diver John Farrar successfully swam from the island to Edgartown in 5 minutes and was a little more discreet, stating, "I think it was quite a feat based on his physical condition." About Kennedy's failure to report the accident, Farrar maintained that a timely reporting would have allowed him to save Mary Jo in less than 45 minutes if the accident was reported immediately, and that she might have lived for a significant amount of time after the car went into the water. Editorial comment from national newspapers was uniformly negative, most demanding answers and a further investigation. Predictably, it was announced that responses received by Senator Kennedy in the form of telegrams, letters, and phone calls to his offices were mostly positive, and he would not resign. Edward Kennedy now maintained that as far as he was concerned, the case was closed, and he would have nothing further to say about the matter. But the matter was suddenly going to spin out of his control. Edmund Denise, the district attorney, wrote to the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court requesting a formal inquest into the incident. Denise also filed a petition for an exhumation of Mary Jo Chappaquiddick's body to perform an autopsy. Denise was in a difficult spot. Initially, he understood that taking on Ted Kennedy and trying to even indict him on a more serious charge would be both difficult and potentially political suicide, and he let Arena take the heat. But the perception that Ted Kennedy had been completely coddled by the legal system ultimately began to reflect on the DA, and he did not want to be known as the man who let Ted Kennedy off of the hook. While the Kennedy camp attempted to fight this request, it was eventually granted, and the inquest scheduled for January 1970. However, the request by Kennedy attorneys to conduct the inquest in secret, a highly unusual event, was granted by the state Supreme Judicial Court. It reasoned publicly that such a proceeding, with the intense public attention paid to the case, might jeopardize any potential ability for Ted Kennedy to receive a fair trial in any future potential prosecution. The decision only inflamed media outrage and public skepticism. In the meantime, the request for an exhumation, placed before a Pennsylvania judge, was rejected. The Chappaquiddick's were at the time relieved by this outcome, feeling that granting such a request would only fuel rumors, the most high-profile innuendo that Mary Jo was pregnant at the time of her death. However, they would come to regret this outlook as mystery continued to swirl around their daughter's death for years afterwards. Eventually, they would receive approximately $140,000 from a combination of Kennedy's insurance company and Kennedy himself. the figure derived from what was believed to be Chappaquiddick's potential earnings in the course of her lifetime. Two other important events also occurred in Ted Kennedy's personal life, both possibly related to the stress created by the Chappaquiddick incident. Joan Kennedy miscarried shortly after the Chappaquiddick funeral, and Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. passed away on November 18, 1969, only months after Senator Kennedy's accident. The senior Kennedy was said to be deeply distraught by the incident, believing correctly that it meant that his last son would never be president. The inquest took place beginning on January 5, 1970. The presiding judge was again James Boyle, after much legal wrangling as to the appropriate legal venue. Boyle began by stressing that the inquest was not a trial. It was merely an inquiry as to whether criminal conduct resulted in a death. The inquest would be conducted by Edmund Denise, the district attorney for the Southern District of the state of Massachusetts, who requested the proceeding in the first place. Although Denise had a lengthy list of witnesses he wished to question before Ted Kennedy, Judge Boyle interceded, stating that he would not keep a U.S. senator waiting. Only Denise, his legal staff, testifying witnesses, and their attorneys were permitted in the courtroom. Witnesses and their attorneys were the only other individuals present. The inquest began with a testimony of Senator Kennedy. Kennedy gave an overview of his day leading up to the cookout and then got to the critical information concerning his departure. He stated that he left the party at 11:15, requesting the keys from chauffeur Jack Crimmins, and that he turned down Crimmins' offer to drive him to the ferry slip because he did not want to interrupt Crimmins' meal and fellowship his assistant was enjoying. This despite Crimmins actually openly telling guests that he wished they would leave. A car would be necessary because Mary Jo had requested that she be dropped off at her motel, as she was not feeling well and also wished to leave. This despite leaving her handbag at the cottage. He denied any personal relationship with Chappaquiddick, and anticipating subsequent testimony, he denied seeing, passing, or even stopping the vehicle at any time. His description of the accident itself included a general description of the sequence of events, that he believed he would drown, and the conclusion, "I have no idea in the world how I got out of the car." Kennedy denied being under the influence of alcohol after being asked specifically about this by Judge Boyle. He claimed he had a third of a beer at the Shiretown Inn and 2 rum and cokes at the party. He recounted the 15-minute walk back to the cottage, in which he claimed to walk, stumble, and jog as quickly as he could through near total darkness in which he saw no visible light. He then spotted Ray LaRosa on the porch and told him to get Gargan and Markham. Kennedy then sitting in the back of the other car, the white Plymouth Valiant. He said this was about 12:20 because he looked at the clock in the automobile. Subsequently, the Boston Globe determined that this make and model of Plymouth Valiant did not have a clock, and Kennedy then publicly claimed that he actually had asked Gargan for the time. Denise then asked if Kennedy at this point was fully aware of Gargan and Markham's rescue attempts, an attempt to clarify Kennedy's previous statements about shock and scrambled thoughts. Kennedy responded that he was fully aware of Gargan and Markham's attempts to rescue Mary Jo. Then Denise followed with, "Was there any effort made to call for assistance?" Kennedy replied no, other than the attempts by Gargan and Markham. Denise then followed up by reiterating that these efforts failed and seemed to be again ready to focus on why no police or even fire personnel were not contacted when Boyle cut off the prosecutor and requested that Kennedy leave the courtroom. Boyle then asserted that the purpose of the inquest was to determine whether criminal conduct contributed to the death of Miss Chappaquiddick, and not bad decisions that occurred subsequently. From his perspective, Denise then maintained that what the witness did after the accident may also have been a criminal act, especially a failure to act which could contribute to a manslaughter charge. After a lengthy exchange, Denise then threatened to walk out of the proceeding, bringing the entire event to a halt. Although not used to this type of in-court challenge to his authority, Boyle realized that any such cessation would result in absolute bedlam from certainly the press and much of the public as well. He allowed Denise to continue, but began to interrupt him frequently, reprimanding him for adopting a prosecutorial tone in what was officially an inquest. With Ted Kennedy's return to the witness stand, Denise got right to the point, asking if there was any particular reason why he did not report the accident to the police or fire department. Kennedy claimed that he intended on doing that as soon as they got back in the Valiant. Denise asked what prevented such a notification. Rather than answering the question, Kennedy asked permission to better describe what specifically happened during this immediate time period. Without an objection, he went on a long-winded description of his desire to first notify the Chappaquiddick, his own parents, and his wife, ostensibly so that they would be aware of what had happened before the accident became public. He added that despite advice to immediately report the accident, he told Gargan to go back to the cottage and not to alarm the other guests. He described with great specifics his swim across the channel, with an emphasis on almost drowning again, his exhaustion, throbbing headache, and back strain. Kennedy then claimed to have changed into dry clothes, and hearing noise all around him, opened the door to his room, and looking outside, saw what he thought might have been a tourist, and after asking the time, returned to his room. Additional questions about events of the following morning then ensued, and when Denise attempted to drill down on why Kennedy did not go directly to police to immediately report the accident, Boyle called a luncheon recess. When the inquest resumed, Denise refocused on whether Kennedy had promptly reported the accident. Boyle repeatedly cut off this line of questioning to the extent that Denise, realizing that any ability to truly impeach Ted Kennedy was not going to happen. After 3 hours, Denise stated that he had no further questions. With a promise that he would return to the witness stand if necessary, Ted Kennedy was free to leave. To the press outside, he stated that when the transcript was released, he expected to be fully vindicated. Denise seemed to lose steam after the initial jousting with Ted Kennedy. Lengthy questioning of Joe Gargan revealed such details of the temperature used to cook the hors d'oeuvres at the party and little else. Markham also mainly reiterated information that was not damaging to Ted Kennedy. Party participants LaRosa and Treader made statements that conflicted with the timelines given by the Kennedy camp, but neither Denise or Boyle followed up on any confusion. All 5 boiler room girls would then testify unanimously that they had seen Mary Jo leave by at the latest 11:30, some noticing the senator leaving at about the same time. They also did not describe any anxiety about noticing at certain times that it was past midnight, the ferry was closed, and both cars were missing for long periods of time from the cottage, the Oldsmobile permanently. Even Judge Boyle became excitable over this blatantly contrived testimony, asking incredulously and repeatedly that with absolutely no means of getting back to Edgartown, no one was concerned as to being completely left in the lurch on a strange island in the middle of the night. What Boyle probably sensed was that all of the Kennedy sympathetic witnesses, including the senator, were completely briefed and coached as to how to answer critical questions. On the 3rd day of the inquest, Christopher Huck Look repeated what he had stated already at the request for the exhumation of Mary Jo, which occurred in a courtroom in Pennsylvania. Look's account of what he saw during the early morning of July 19th is by far the most damaging and beguiling information presented about the entire Chappaquiddick affair. Timing was crucial in terms of when Ted Kennedy and Mary Jo left the cottage, because if they were truly attempting to catch the last ferry and leave the island, the last ferry would leave at midnight. But Huck Look's observations are not only powerful, they are incontrovertible based on how he spent the evening. Look owned a small local fuel oil company, but he augmented his wages by serving in various law enforcement departments throughout Edgartown and the Vineyard. For years he worked off-duty shifts at the Edgartown Yacht Club's events, an assignment for which he dressed in his Dukes County deputy sheriff's uniform. 41 years of age, 6 foot 2 inches, 235 pounds, Look's physical build and official dress would discourage any party crashers or rowdy behavior, especially on the regatta weekend. But Look's Friday evening was uneventful, and at precisely 12:30 a.m., when the yacht club dance concluded, a yacht club employee conveyed him by launch across the channel to the ferry slip on the Chappaquiddick side, where Look had previously left his car for his anticipated ride home. Within minutes, Look was in his car and headed to his home on the island. Huck currently living on Chappaquiddick. Familiar with the extended curve on Chappaquiddick Road and noticing an automobile heading in the opposite direction, out of habit, Look slowed to a crawl, but instead of making the curve, the car, a large dark sedan, proceeded straight in front of Look's car, its occupants, a man and a woman, illuminated in his headlights. As Look made the turn, he noticed the car in his rearview mirror, now stopped at the entrance to a virtually unused road that led to an abandoned cemetery. Look had driven about 60 feet, and presuming that the car's occupants, still stationary, were either lost or confused, he got out of his vehicle and began walking in the auto's direction. With Huck Look about 30 feet away and walking in the dead center of the road, the driver in the car suddenly threw it into reverse, the lights illuminating the license plate, which Look noticed consisted of several L's and 7s, a favorite number he wore as a high school athlete. It then proceeded rapidly down the unpaved, rutted dike road in the direction of the dike bridge. At first, Look's instincts kicked in, and he sensed that the driver, who would have clearly seen a uniformed individual approaching, wanted to avoid an interaction. Look's initial inclination was to rush back to his car and give chase, but he quickly decided against that. The driver had not done anything that was even a traffic violation, and Look figured it was probably some confused tourist who was now making their way towards the beach area. Getting back into his car, Look then happened upon 3 people walking and dancing in unison in the vicinity. This was the Lyon sisters and La Rosa strolling about the neighborhood near the cottage. When Huck Look stopped and asked if everyone was okay, one of the girls essentially told him to buzz off, which almost irritated Look to the point of getting out of his car before La Rosa quietly and courteously assured Look that they were fine and merely going back to the Lawrence cottage, which he pointed to. Again, at almost 1 a.m, Look decided to let it all slide and went home for the night. But when he saw the car being extricated from Poocha Pond the next morning and seeing the license plate, he was emphatic that this was the same car he observed heading down the Dike Road at about 12:45 a.m. John Farrar, the diver who removed Mary Jo Kopechne, then began to testify about whether or not Mary Jo drowned or suffocated based on the location of her body. Judge Boyle cut off his testimony. Farrar's testimony strictly limited to the position of the car when he examined it. Denise did not even call any of the occupants of the Dyke House, who clearly could have rebutted Senator Kennedy's assertion that he did not see any illuminated homes in the vicinity of the bridge. The inquest report from Boyle was not made public until April 29, 1970. In the meantime, at the conclusion of the inquest, Leslie Leland, the foreman of the Dukes County Grand Jury, officially requested that he and other grand jury members be allowed to investigate the case as well. Both D.A. Denise and the judge eventually assigned to the case Wilfred Packett, a longtime Massachusetts Democratic politician and Kennedy supporter, did everything possible to sabotage the grand jury's investigation. Packett began the grand jury proceedings by asserting that the grand jury could not subpoena anyone who testified at the inquest, and denied a request to see either the inquest transcripts and Judge Boyle's report itself. Denise also stated to the grand jury that there was nothing in the inquest transcript or Boyle's report that implicated Ted Kennedy in any criminal wrongdoing. Both of these fundamental assertions were untrue. The grand jury could have subpoenaed anyone they wanted to, including Ted Kennedy, but after only 20 minutes of testimony that was completely innocuous, they concluded their investigation, and the grand jury was dismissed. Boyle's analysis was publicly released in late April of 1970. Despite the judge's seemingly benign attitude toward the senator during the inquest proceeding itself, his official analysis was scathing. In it, he asserted that the testimony presented contained contradictions and inconsistencies, that the accident may have occurred between 11:30 p.m. and 1 a.m., that Ted Kennedy's turn down Dyke Road was deliberate and not a mistake, and that already, having passed over the bridge twice during the day, his speed of at least 20 miles an hour was at least negligent and possibly reckless, and such an operation appears to have contributed to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. While Kennedy's assertion that this turn was made in error, such a mistake would be immediately obvious to a motorist. The road to the ferry was paved and banked sharply to the left. The dike road was bumpy and unpaved and turned in almost the opposite angle of direction. Judge Boyle's analysis, especially of the turn itself, was an obvious conclusion. But after indicating that there was a foundation to prosecute Senator Kennedy for more serious criminal charges, the judge did not issue a warrant of arrest, perhaps deliberately dumping the whole mess in the lap of DA Edmund Denise, who ultimately declined to file any additional charges. Senator Kennedy publicly rejected Boyle's analysis without any specifics, and he also added, "I plan no further statement on this tragic matter," an attitude he subsequently usually maintained for the rest of his life, answering any general questions with a terse, "I've answered all of the questions." Perhaps anticipating retaliation from the Kennedy camp, Judge James Boyle retired only days after his findings were released. Although Ted Kennedy retained his Senate seat, he did suffer consequences over the Chappaquiddick incident. Although publicly supportive, his own Democratic Senate caucus removed him as Senate Majority Whip in January of 1971 after only one term, replacing him with Robert Byrd. He did not seek the presidency in 1972 or 1976, and then an ill-fated attempt at defeating Jimmy Carter in 1980 failed spectacularly. Chappaquiddick one of several reasons for the campaign's failure. For some time, exactly what happened in the immediate aftermath of the accident remained a mystery, with all of the major players, including the Boiler Room girls, refusing to comment about what they experienced. All of these women went on to successful careers as activists, attorneys, or in the case of Esther Newberg, a powerhouse literary agent for ICM. This despite their unhappiness at being depicted as mere secretaries or even bimbo playthings for married men, including Ted Kennedy. Mary Jo Kopechne and her associates were political operatives who coordinated RFK campaign activity on an individual statewide basis. Although unhappy as to how they were portrayed, for many years they still maintain a code of silence over the event, limiting any specific description of exactly what happened. This changed with the publication of the book Senatorial Privilege and Joseph Gargan's very detailed account of the attitudes and behavior of Senator Kennedy, including the allegation that Kennedy wanted to blame Mary Jo for actually driving the car off of the bridge, that Gargan could then discover the wreckage and leave the senator back at Edgartown entirely out of any involvement. By 1988, Gargan no longer was politically involved with the Kennedys, and he perceived that somehow Ted and others blamed him for not bailing the senator out in typical jovial fix-it style. It was also believed that Gargan, expecting that Rose Kennedy would leave him a substantial amount of money from her sizable estate, instead decided to leave Gargan a much more modest amount, a development he was aware of. And the long arm of the Kennedy clan almost stopped Gargan's account of ever seeing the light of day. The book was originally supposed to be released by Random House, but most likely after intercession from the Kennedys, the publisher balked and then sued DeMore to get its sizable advance returned. No other major publisher would subsequently touch the book until it was released by Regnery Publishing, a small Washington, D.C. outfit that typically featured conservative viewpoints and writers. DeMore's tireless publicity efforts turned the book into a national bestseller and the definitive work on the Chappaquiddick incident. But he was unable to follow up this success and committed suicide in 1995, in debt, experiencing psychological issues, and his publishing career having lost any momentum. Ted Kennedy's attempt to place Mary Jo at the wheel may not have been a fabrication. Although only Senator Kennedy knew exactly who was driving when the car went into the water, several journalists and even investigators came to the conclusion that Kennedy, afraid that Huck Look might come looking for him, got out of the car and told Mary Jo to go to the end of the road, turn around, and come back and get him if the coast was clear. This theory centers on the belief that Kennedy would not have been able to escape from the sunken automobile, and his inability to explain how that occurred underlines that it probably never happened. Kennedy's alleged shock and confusion also doesn't explain his ability to summon Gargan and Markham from the cottage so as not to alert any other partygoers as to his presence, and his appearance before a hotel clerk at 2:20 a.m., where he appeared completely composed and fashionably dressed, indicates that such mental confusion was invented. Mary Jo, at 5'3" tall, owned a VW Beetle and would not have been familiar with operating such a large automobile. Her blood alcohol level, when subsequently tested, was a .09, and she was most likely at least legally and possibly very intoxicated at the time of the accident. Ted Kennedy could possibly dissemble about driving off the bridge and at least make the claim that he had gotten lost and barely escaped drowning himself. But acknowledging that he deliberately got out of the car, most likely also intoxicated, with a single woman present, indicated that not only was he trying to hide such behavior, but understood that any public knowledge of such conduct would be far worse and make the incident much more egregious and indefensible than merely a disastrous car accident. So, in the moment, much like his behavior as a law student many years earlier, he chose instead to try and run and hide. And afterwards, he stuck to a story that, while damaging, was nowhere near as politically catastrophic as practically abandoning a young girl to a terrible fate while attempting to evade law enforcement. The subsequent legal machinations on Senator Kennedy's behalf added an even more disturbing layer to this utterly sordid affair. In 1974, while discussing the pardon of Richard Nixon, Edward M. Kennedy stated, "Do we operate under a system of equal justice under law, or is there one system for the average citizen and another for the high and mighty?" Judging from his own personal experience, Senator Kennedy already knew that question's answer. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about Senator Ted Kennedy. Information for this podcast came from the books The Bridge at Chappaquiddick by Jack Olson and Senatorial Privilege by Leo DeMore. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page. And remember that Bite-Sized Biographies are available on Spotify. And also remember to please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.